Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm so happy to be back here in Vilnius physically on stage. Can you just quickly show of hands if this is not your first conference here, if you have been here more than once? Right, yeah, it's a couple of folks who've been there. I vividly remember the first time I've been on stage here in 2018 when I was speaking for GitHub, how GitHub is using GitHub to build GitHub. And when I was looking at the screen since then, I thought, wow, this has so many pixels. It's such an amazing canvas. Next time, promise when I'll be back, I'll do a live demo, right? And here I am. And most of this talk will actually be a live demo, lots of hands-on coding on how to programmatically access and automate all of those OpenAI APIs. You might have heard once or twice about this thing called ChatGPT, which was not even exposed as an API when I handed in the talk. So most of the APIs I'm actually showing you today are not ChatGPT. ChatGPT will be part of it, but it's also the less known ones like Whisper, DaVinci, DALL-E to generate pictures or generate text out of, for instance, audio files. And to make this really fun, I thought let's mesh up all of those APIs so that you can specify your own company. Then AI will find out what your company does, like what product it produces, and then we will turn those products into Lego miniatures or chocolate or gold or whatever floats your boat. So all of those materials are on GitHub and on Postman. If you make a copy of that slide, if you just follow the QR code, you can follow all those examples, including all the CI/CD pipelines to integrate Postman into your development workflow. Since 2018, many things changed. I also left GitHub after 6.5 years being there, and I now work at Postman. Can you just show of hands if you have heard about Postman before? Yes, right. So this is literally everybody. Postman is not too different from GitHub in the sense that GitHub has the largest open source community developing, collaborating on source code. And for APIs, this is what Postman is about. So there's more than 25 million developers and testers on the platform. Lots of stuff is done in the open source world, but there's, similar to GitHub, also many companies who use it for their own private or enterprise projects, which are shielded from the public world. What we call repositories in GitHub would be called workspaces in Postman. And the interesting workspace for this presentation is obviously the OpenAI workspace, which has all of those ChatGPT, Whisper, DALL-E, DaVinci APIs in them. I just took this screenshot when I was boarding the flight. So it had 6,480 forks since then. So let's have a look how many there are if we just check in right now by going over Postman's artificial intelligence category search. So the Postman one just today, it's 6,680K. So it's really going like crazy at the moment, right? So there's many hundred forks every week just joining to test all those examples. I'm one of the main contributors to that workspace. So if you have checked it out and you've seen some of the examples and visualizations, you will probably see something familiar. For the purpose of this particular talk, I created a separate workspace, which is just not as complex and generic as the reference OpenAI workspace, but that one is linked in the slide as well. So my workspace, which I prepared for the demo, can be easily found in Postman over the web interface or our desktop app by searching for fun, Lego, and AI. And you will see in a moment what this has to do with Lego. If you just search for fun, Lego, and AI, it should show up. And you want to test this out, right? This is basically the mission of Postman. You want to test things out, not just look at documentation. And it should be no friction testing stuff out. So what you would need to do, as you probably don't have write access to that workspace, would be to create a fork in any of your namespaces. I'm just creating it in the same workspace here for the sake of simplicity, right? And then you could just start right in. And for instance, as we are at a DevOps conference, start with a definition of what DevOps is about in one of their OpenAI APIs. And then you typically would hit the first snag, right? You try to send this one, and boom, you get a or one unauthorized, right? Because that's typically the biggest friction for any of your APIs and for any of your developers. How would they actually get access keys, right? This is where more than 90% of people just give up. Fortunately, for any API now on Postman, the inventors of this API can specify credential helpers, right? You see this need help authorize with OpenAI, and this directs you to the part of OpenAI where you can just get one of those API keys, right? So by default, you get $18 for free when you wanted to try out OpenAI in your own programs. I'm just creating a API key right now called Vilnius. Copy that one in, and then can use it within Postman. If you don't want to share this with Postman in the cloud, but you just want to have it on your own computer, you would just save them to an environment. This is actually what I was just doing. So we automatically switch to the OpenAI API environment, and now finally we can run this one call again, and now we should actually get a definition of what OpenAI thinks DevOps is about, right? So it's a culture where developers and operations team collaborate and work together to deliver software. So this is great, right? I said it's about fun, Lego, and AI though. So the second model I like to show you is the DALL-E model. Many of you have probably used that one already, right? It's basically just a simple API where you provide a prompt, the amount of pictures you want to show and how big those pictures should be, and then you hit send, and then you would get a response which is interesting to look at, but probably not that interesting if you don't follow those URLs. The thing about Postman is you cannot only write tests with it, but you can also use the testing tab to have visualizations in it, meaning any API response you have, you can turn into HTML using JavaScript. So here we're just looking at all of those URLs and putting them into image tags. And this is then the visualization. This is actually Vilnius's old town made of Lego, or at least what OpenAI DALL-E's model thinks about it. So that's so far pretty standard, right? I guess many of you have tested this out before. I wanted to show you some less known capabilities of DALL-E, like creating image edits. We have a mascot at Postman, which is the Postman out, and a German artist did a wooden sculpture I just found, which is that one. I thought it's pretty cute. Let's replace that helmet, right? Using DALL-E. So in DALL-E, you can upload a second picture, which looks similar, but has certain pixels removed, which you also want to remove from the picture you want to manipulate. So basically, it's just a transparent helmet over here. And if you then go to the image editing capabilities, there's two parameters, one for the original picture, then one for the one with the alpha channels, with the transparent helmet, and then you would just say what to do with those transparent pixels. And I said replace this face with a smiling Neil Armstrong. So let's just run that one, and then we will see what OpenAI provides us. While this is running, you can obviously include this into all of your programs in the programming language of your choice. So you would use Postman to first test out those APIs and then just generate the code as the mashup API I'm showing later. It will be based on JavaScript. I'm actually copy pasting these client calls with a JavaScript. And this is already a more complicated API with form upload. So there's definitely worth using Postman. So this is how Neil Armstrong would look like. I mean, it's different every time. Well, it's a wooden Neil Armstrong. I mean, you get the idea. The other API I wanted to show you is Whisper. Has any of you used Whisper before? Can you show of hand? 2 or 3. So this is more of an exotic one. In Whisper, you can turn audio into text and also translate it. So this is the example with the audio file I wanted to play, which is currently not playing. Let's try it again.
Hello, this is Linus Torvalds, and I pronounce Linux as Linux.
the famous recording from Linus, the inventor of Linux, how to pronounce Linux. And if we uploaded that one into Postman, right, you would just provide the MP3, send that one, and then you would get the translation of it in text, right? So that's the Whisper API. The last API I wanted to show you, after we've seen text completion using DaVinci for the DevOps definition and doing some image generation and audio translation, is of course ChatGPT, right? And for ChatGPT, I have prepared a special example. So we're going for the GPT-3.5 model, and we actually want to analyze a GitHub repository automatically. That GitHub repository URL mentioned over here. And if we went to that GitHub repository, this is actually our live demo, right? This is the API we want to build today, right? And before I give you more details about the API we are building today, I want to ask ChatGPT what this repository is actually being doing. So let's fire up that request over here, and then we should get a response. And as with any other requests, you can just turn them into a call in a programming language of your choice. ChatGPT also has some streaming capabilities so that you don't have to wait that long, but can actually get results posted in the same speed as they are generated. For that, you would set the streaming parameter to true, right? This is then using server-side eventing. In our case, we got an answer. Let's visualize that again. So that repository is an implementation of an AI-powered system that evaluates the appeal of companies based on their financial performance. So here you see that's completely bullshit, right? So OpenAI often makes things up, right? And if you basically want to control how much it actually tries to invent facts or being creative, the higher you would set the temperature, right? So a high temperature would mean it would be quite, well, it would give you a great variety of answers, but they are not necessarily correct, right? So AI is not everything here. That's also a lesson from that talk, I hope. So with a lower temperature, we probably get a better result. Actually, the repository in question, right, that is a web application, right, and it more to generate appealing company descriptions. That's much better. It takes the company name as input and generates a description. So that's already going in the right direction. What this API is actually doing is what we can find out from its documentation in Postman. You would just specify any kind of company. We would then use the DaVinci API to find out about its products. And then there's a second parameter you would pass into that API to then turn those products into something made of Lego, chocolate, or gold. So let's just try that one out. There's one API endpoint to just list some example companies that have interesting products so that people get a feeling what this API is all about, right? So you will see just a list of different companies and their products made of gold, plush, or so on. But let's put this to the test. Does any of you have an interesting company where we could just do a live demo? Just shout it in. Silence. Who? Mono active? Can try that like this. Moon active. Well, let's try. How OpenAI sees your company in this case. Right, so it's first calling DALL-E and DaVinci and then generates a picture. It's known for mobile games, Coin Master. Is that correct? And that would be the visualization of it, right? So yeah, so you can all try out this API. The question is how was this API actually written, and how was this documentation created? I didn't write anything on this on my own. This is all generated based on an OpenAI spec. Can you show of hands of who of you have worked with OpenAPIs? That's something familiar to you. Yeah, so it's a couple of folks, maybe 30%. In short terms, OpenAI is basically a specification. Many of you might know Swagger, right? Swagger, OpenAPI is basically Swagger 3.0, and it's a way to describe what an API is doing without having access or the need for the backend implementation. So you can already define its endpoints, like in this case, list of companies, and the parameters for it, like the company ID and the material, and then based on that, later generate the documentation, generate contract tests, generate even the server boilerplate implementation. So it's a great way to already test something similar to the domain-driven design aspect in the keynote you have seen yesterday, to already communicate what your API is doing without needing to have access to the code or model all of this. So where would you find OpenAPI specifications? Well, the answer is obviously Postman. There's hundreds of thousands OpenAPI descriptions in the Postman public API network. But if you are part of a company and you have your own APIs, then Postman also provides you that concept of a so-called private API network. And a private API network is basically something like a gallery of your best APIs to start new APIs from, where you can find everything which is running in production within your own company. We were now searching for AI, for instance, we would see everything AI related. And in this case, there's also the API description for this AP-Link companies one, which is versioned. So obviously you can have multiple versions running into production. Let's have a look at the latest one by just viewing them in the workspace where it has been defined. And yeah, you would find the definition of it, and then all of those Postman collections, like the contract tests, the documentation, this has all been auto-generated, and whenever I change the specification, it would also allow me to regenerate or change the collections that are associated with it. If we wanted to generate server code now for that one, we would again click on the sidebar for code generation and select the framework of our choice. In our case, I'm going for a Node.js Express server. Could also say I already have some code. I just want to get the differences to last time I generated that. And then I would just take that code and yeah, upload it to GitHub, right? This is what I've already done. So let's go to GitHub and have a look at it. We have this repository. I created a fork from it to not interface with the rest, and I created a branch for our examples, and inside that branch I have a GitHub code space. And let's see whether this code space is still up and running. It's testing. Yeah, it's up and running. If you wanted to test this out on your own, you would just clone the repository, and everything you would have to do is to run npm start, right? And then it would just boot things up in code spaces. In GitHub, you can also have ports forwarded to your local computer. This is what we have done here, just saying that anybody could access whatever is running in that code space. And then we would take that URL and test it within Postman. So let's go back here and see whether our preview environment actually supports that, right? So we would go to the environment for code spaces and just send the request and hope that it's actually working. Yes, so we get the results we were thinking about here as well. And now we want to change things, right? I mean, so far we've supported a couple of materials. We have not really looked into what kind of materials we actually support yet, right? We have seen some examples made of Lego so far. So let's have a look at the parameters we currently have. One is material. And for material, you see it's basically providing chocolate, Lego, gold, plush, and platin. So those are the ones in question. So what would happen if I tried something else, which is not implemented yet? If I said I want to issue some request against production, and I want to try out, for instance, this Postman out we had, right? So we say we want to check out Postman as a company, and as material we choose wood, for instance, because it was made of wood. In this case, we actually get a 400 status error code because the allowed materials we have are just chocolate, Lego, gold, plush, and platinum, no wood, right? So this is also the great thing if you're working on a specification similar to the types you have seen yesterday in the keynote, it automatically validates what your API will support, right? So there's no server code that needs to be written in order to just check that the parameters you accept are actually the ones in the OpenAPI spec. So let's actually change this and add a wood material to it. So we go and edit API, and then we also see that we can now actually work on editing this definition real time. You also see that it's checked into GitHub. So Postman allows CI/CD integration with GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket on-prem, and in the cloud, if you're interested in that one. And we, as said, wanted to add some material here, which is wood. So we're going to the material select section and say that we would also like to support wood as a material. You already see that there's now a change we did. We see something else though, right? You see 4 rules here, including some rules which have a severity error, meaning we did something wrong with our OpenAPI spec. It's possible to lint it and get security warnings as well as styling warnings based on spectral rules. Any of you have worked with spectral before for API specs? It's pretty new development. Doesn't look like this. So, so in a nutshell, you can define rules for your APIs, and some of them are currently broken in here. And that's also why, for instance, if we go to GitHub, you would see that currently those tests are not running through. You would see the very same problems in our pull request, meaning at the moment we wouldn't even be able to commit that change into production. And the reason is that, for instance, we use OpenAI tokens for authentication and still allow a plain text. So those you see in HTTP instead of in HTTPS. That's the problem, right? If we change that, then you would see there's only all the errors are gone. There's still one version, semantic versioning problem. In OpenAPI specs, it's common to use semantic versioning. So this is a custom spectral rule I added, which is basically enforcing semantic versioning. So I will remove that Vilnius part of the version number, and now we should actually be good, right? There's just one warning left. So you can just see what we changed. We changed that version number. We fixed that bug with the plain endpoint, and we added wood. So let's say fingers crossed, and commit this into our feature branch. And once we commit this into the feature branch, it will automatically run all the contract tests and integration tests against our API. We have not looked into those contract tests yet. So what they basically do is they first check whether for this new material, you will get an example in the list of companies, and then we will also ask for a specific company with that new material, in this case wood, to see whether the API returns it properly. And at the end, you see a completely different API request, which is going to the GitHub issues API. In Postman, it's possible and often done to combine multiple APIs with each other. Think about your own company. You want to test some complex API setup. It typically means you start with just logging into your application, then you probably search for something, then you put something maybe in a shopping cart, then you check out and do credit card assessments and all that stuff. So in many cases, you're going across multiple APIs. So you're chaining those requests together, and that's possible with Postman as well. So at the end of those tests, we want to actually see those generated picture of the test data. Talking about the test data, if we run this within our web UI and it's running in the background also in CI/CD. If we run this against production, we would actually not think that this should work, right? Because in production, we don't know about the wood material yet. Where do we even have the test data? Well, in Postman, you can load JSON files as well as CSV files with all the parameters you want to go through in your tests. So if you have lots of generated test data, you could just put them in a CSV file or generate that one and then have your tests running for each of those. And you see here, the first test entry is Postman and that new wood material. So if we run this tests from the UI, we would actually expect that at least for wood, it's currently failing in production, right? For the other materials which have existed before, there shouldn't be that problem. Right, so if you also see the failed test, and if I click onto it, you'll also see that the 400 error we have seen before, that wood is not yet a supported material. That's hopefully different in our feature branch, right, where we added wood as a material. We can see what's going on either in GitHub, or we would also be able to see it directly out of Postman. So it also brings all the integration tests back in here. Let's go into GitHub for that pull request. See whether it was actually running through. And you see all checks have passed. So we now should also see pictures in here, right? Those were the pictures generated by the integration tests and contract tests when they have been running through in our CI/CD pipeline. So that thing is clearly generated as part of the test data, right? This is Postman now generated by using DaVinci and the DALL-E API. But what about this guy, right? This looks exactly like the picture I've shown you at the beginning. And the reason it looks like exactly like this is that this is not coming back from our preview server. This is actually something something coming back from a mock server. Can you show of hands if you have worked with API mock servers? That's some people, but a small amount of people. So basically, a mock server is a possibility to simulate your API, even if your backend is not ready yet. Think about, for instance, you're specifying a new functionality. You already have your mobile app and your web application or some partners, and they wanted to test how your API is feeling, but yeah, there's no backend ready, or they don't have access to that backend, right? You still want to get their feedback, and this is how a mock API works. Or let's show how this looks in practice in Postman. If we go to the public workspace where you have all access to, there's also a mock server in it. And that mock server, you see all the calls that are coming in, like the ones for chocolate, Lego, and so on from our integration test. And it has a URL, and it's running on a collection as well, right? And that collection in this case is a mock collection. So it looks very similar to what you have seen so far regarding the requests, list all companies and get companies. The difference, though, is that you have lots of sample responses. Those sample responses are basically requests, like here you see X and material gold coming in. And if this, for instance, is sent to your mock server, Postman will return this particular answer here, right? So it's possible to select for multiple companies what kind of a response should be provided. So if we were testing this out and saying we want to do this request against a public mock server, you would see it's now returning it's now returning backs made of gold. But what you also see is that it's possible to do a little bit of variation. So it's not always static responses. Here, for instance, it's parsing the material out of the request which is coming in, meaning if I, for instance, were to change the material to plush in here and run the request again, you'd see that the material is now showing up as plush. So it's also possible to have some responses depending on the parameters that are coming in. So you could have for your own APIs, depending on the parameters, just record sample responses and those will be returned. If I tried actually Postman here as a company, you will notice that there's no return, or there should actually be nothing meaningful return so far. And the reason is we don't have an example for Postman in here yet. We just introduced that newly, and it was done in a private workspace. But in Postman, you have the possibility to have pull requests and pull changes between workspaces to save a lot of time. Meaning if I now pull those changes in from my private workspace, you can see that we just modified that collection, right? Many companies, they export and import Postman collections manually, which takes a lot of time. What you can also do is use pull requests and pull changes and collaborate in real time so that you don't have that productivity problem and can save a lot of effort. So I'm just pulling those changes in. And now if we are actually repeating that Postman case, right, you should actually see that we're now getting something meaningful delivered back. I'm just checking time. I like to show you two more things, right? One thing is about how you could make your own API accessible to people way easier than maybe you have done so far, right? This is actually working with mock servers and live collections. So if we had any documentation for your own API, you could publish this to a website on your company. And this one will then be live synchronized with whatever you have as your API documentation. So if I change this, for instance, to Vilnius DevOps Pro and saved it, this URL where this one is published at will automatically also show the new title, right? So with that, you can expose your API to anybody who is interested in working with it. And in many cases, you probably don't have users who don't have access to your production environment for various reasons. But in Postman, you can provide them also a mock server as part of those published websites. So if any of your end users were to click on this button, run in Postman in your generated documentation, they would be leaded to a fork dialog where they can just say where to fork this collection in. And as part of the fork, they don't only fork your collection so that they can try it out and contribute back, but also the mock server environment. Meaning if we, for instance, were to now, if we were now to test against your production server, it works for unauthenticated endpoints, right, where everybody can work on. But if you were to try, for instance, Moon Active now on an unauthenticated, on an endpoint which would need authentication, then your production environment wouldn't be accessible to anybody trying it out. What you really want to do is also provide them access to a mock server. So we would just turn on this mock server, which got forked as well as part of running, of clicking that run in Postman button. And if you were now to repeat that one, you would get an answer if the mock server knew about Moon Active yet. Doesn't know about Moon Active yet, right? Because we just, this was just some spontaneous answer. But if we were, for instance, to go against Postman, then we should now get a response, right? It's exactly that what we just created and merged a couple of minutes before. So last question I typically then get is, how can I feed my mock server? How can I provide all of the examples? Do I have to create them by your own? No, you don't, right? You can just have OpenAPI spec turned into a mock server if you wanted to, or you use a concept of so-called live collections. Have you heard about live collections before? Anybody? So that is a pretty new feature in Postman, which allows you to instrument your backend code. So in this case, this is our backend code for this mashup API. And if you include the Postman SDK into it, it will intercept all the communication it's getting in and will turn this into a live collection. Meaning it will actually record all of the calls you have done and turn them into a collection, right? We were, for instance, trying out Moon Active, as you see here, against our production server, and we got an unauthorized, and we now know that in Postman because that one has just been pushed into that live collection as our production server was instrumented with the Postman SDK. So that's also a neat way if you wanted to start with something that is where you don't even know what kind of API you're providing. It's legacy code. It does something. There's all kind of endpoints. You don't even have an idea how they are called. Then you would just instrument it with the Postman SDK and build your live collection on top of it, right? So this is this was the main part of the talk regarding how to build your own API that is based on OpenAI stuff. I did not go into details for things like spectral linting and security rules or like performance testing, which is also possible in Postman. But I thought I would like to use the last 5 minutes on giving you a glimpse preview on what we just launched last week, which is PostBot. It's an AI. Well, AI, guess what? Bullshit, bingo. Everybody has to be part of it. So we are now doing this too. We can now generate test cases made of AI automatically. And as I've said, automatically, it's I like to switch the API where I demo this to something magic. And the API in question is a Harry Potter API. So in this case, we are going to Harry Potter API, which basically allows you to list all of the characters and spells within Harry Potter. Again, it's using the visualization, right? You see all the characters of it. They have lots of properties like name, species, gender, house, and so on. And what we would like to do for listing all the students is check that Hermione is in the same house as Harry, right? And what we want Postman to do or PostBot to do is to just dynamically generate a test case that is checking that Hermione is part of the same house as Harry Potter, right? So this is just alpha software. So let's pray to the demo gods. It first says it needs a response. So I call the API once, and now I'm starting the AA generation, and hopefully it will do something. Otherwise, I have a backup. Ran this before. And this is going through the structure of the source code, of the returned API calls, and find out, well, what kind of tests to write based on the instructions I just provided. Right? It's also possible to just say, generate me some meaningful tests, then it will do this as well. So as you see, it's an alpha software. I'll give it one more try. Otherwise, I will show you what I've prepared so far. Let the magic kick in. A few more seconds and I'll be done. Yay! So it actually created us a test case, and well, to response code 200. That's not too smart. But now we see that it's also checking that Hermione is part of the result set, and it also checks that she's part of House Gryffindor. I never specified that Gryffindor is the house that should be checked, right? This was just derived by AI because I said it should be the same house as Harry Potter. So if I now ran this one, you see that all the that actually the test case we're running through successfully, but the Hermione one, the one I didn't even ask it to generate, it actually took a little bit more than 200 milliseconds to return. That's why it's red here. And the last example I wanted to do is based on spells. So if we go to the spells API endpoint, you can see all the spells that are part of Harry Potter. That API, you can also just find it if you search Postman for fun and Harry Potter. So all those spells are here, and they have ID, name, and description. And what we want to do now is to check about the 3 unforgivable spells. So in Harry Potter, there are 3 spells you should only use if you're a Death Eater, and we want to log their name and description on the web UI of Postman in the console. So we ask one last time our bot to generate it. It would need a sample response first, and then we can ask it to check how many unforgivable courses there are, check that it's at least 3, and log them to the console. So again, It's awkward in live demos. You never know how long test generation will actually take. But let's keep the fingers crossed, and here we go, right? So it checks for at least 3 unforgivable courses. It checks whether the description includes unforgivable courses, then an assertion that it's at least 3 of them, and then it's logging its name and descriptions out. So let's just run this thing. Test results are going through successfully, and if we go to the console, then we also see Avada Kedavra, Crucio, and Impera. So it really did it just based on having a look at the API responses one. So going forward, we also like to have open Postbot generating documentation for you automatically, and also automatically creating open API snippets and spectral rules so that you can also lint things and also improve performance of your APIs. So it's amazing what API can do. At this point in time, I'm very much looking forward to the panel discussion at 2 p.m. about AI and developers in their current role. I'd like to close my own talk with my personal idea about AI and humans. To replace programmers with AI, clients will need to accurately describe what they want. So far we're safe. Thank you.